Bom dia a todas y a todos. Good morning to everyone. And welcome to the launch of the COP30 report of the Taskforce on Net Zero Policy. Policy matters from pledges to delivery a decade after Paris. But before I start, let me excuse to our audience our biggest apologies. Unfortunately, the Spanish pavilion was set right next to the aircon with no air conditioning. So it's more like a little sauna. So apologies for that. We have complained to the organizers, so please bear with us. And thank you so much for being here despite the incredible heat. So I was saying, our report, I hear an echo, yes? Our report is called Policy Matters from Pledges to Delivery a Decade After Paris. In a few days, we're going to mark the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And we thought at the task force that it was a very good moment to pause, reflect, and assess how much progress has been done since Paris, since the accord was agreed, and at the same time to really examine what has worked and what hasn't worked. And it's true that in 2025, carbon emissions were meant to peak. And yet, even if they haven't peaked, the reality is that the growth of carbon emissions has slowed fivefold to 0.32 before the Paris Agreement was signed. At the same time, we also know that now the overshoot seems inevitable, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail a little bit later. But also what is true is that before the Paris Agreement, we were set in a trajectory of a 4 degrees rise by the end of the century, and now we are in one of 2.8 or even less. And needless to say that renewable has really taken off, mainly driven by everyday lower cost. And today they have overtaken the coal's share of the electricity, the global electricity mix. So the transition is really underway. That's undeniable, and is here to stay, and is unstoppable. Now, that has happened thanks to the Paris Agreement, because what the Paris Agreement did is that it sent a very strong message of confidence to policymakers across the globe, but also to companies and investors, that they could have the confidence to start working on the transition, because the vast majority of countries in the world, almost all, had said very clearly and loud that they are committed to tackle the climate crisis. Now, among all those policies, there's a set of policies that sometimes are less mentioned. And those are all the policies that are aimed at supporting large companies and financial institutions in their transition to net zero. We're mainly talking about corporate and financial regulation, but equally at real economy policies that have specific requirements for companies and for investors. And that type of policies is at the very core of the work of the Task Force on Net Zero Policy. And today what we're going to do is we're going to give you an overview of what has happened over this decade, with a little bit of a zoom in of what happened last year, and then we're going to deconstruct some of those policies. But before we pass to our fireside chat with Nathan, with Christina, and with the board, with some of the board members and task force members who are here today with us today, and I thank them in advance for all their support. There is one message I have for all of you. If you have to leave earlier, or you can no longer bear the sauna, please take this message out with you, which is, in 1 decade, the global climate policy has transformed beyond recognition. And despite the headwinds, despite the real backlash in the US and the recalibration in the EU, policy development has continued across the world. And more than that, what we've seen is that the center of gravitas is moving, shifting south and east, with 3/4 of all the policies having been adopted, outside of North America and Europe. So please take that message with you. Welcome to our launch, and I'm going to start with our fireside chat with Nathan Fabian. No. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. Better. Now I don't hear myself, so it's easier with an echo. Nathan Fabian, I don't think you need any introduction, to be honest, but just in case, and apologies, I'm going to have to take. Nathan Fabian is
Sustainable Systems.
Officer, Chief of Sustainable at UN supported PRI. But he has also been the chair of the EU Platform Sustainable Finance. He has been in this, the sustainable finance world for, I'm not going to say how many years, but a long time. And anyone who works in sustainable finance has Nathan as a reference. So thank you for being here. But today, Nathan is sitting here because he is the head of the Secretariat of the Taskforce on Net Zero Policy. Now, Nathan, first of all, I thought that for those who might not know, we maybe can give a little bit of the history behind the Taskforce. Do you want to start?
Of course. We just congratulate Helena and Andrea for the incredible leadership they've provided. Absolutely. Women who know how to get things done, if I can say that. Another woman who knows how to get things done here. So we must remember that after Paris, when target setting and implementing targets became a priority, there was a lot of focus on what not only governments were doing, but I think an expectation that non-state actors or private actors would start to adopt these targets and apply them. And of course, many did, but they started to be a bit unclear, or it was difficult to be clear about exactly what they were doing. So this question of integrity came up. When you make a claim, when you set your target, when you implement your action, is it real? Is it substantial? Is it going to make a difference? And I think this is what led the Secretary General to start the high-level expert group with a focus on integrity. To say, well, we need to start to examine whether the actions of non-state actors and the policies that require non-state actor action, whether they make sense, whether they require you to have integrity. And of course, markets had already started to shift. This was not just about dropping the burden of transition on non-state actors. Markets were shifting, markets were working, and they have a critical role, but integrity mattered. So this led to the H leg, and of course, Helena was responsible for a specific recommendation in the H leg that focused on policy. And the task force, and this work today, was focusing just on that integrity question.
So in a way, the task force is a little bit like a spin-off from the UN Secretary General High-Level Expert Group that was part, and we have Bill Hare here with us, who was the scientist within the group. And we decided that basically, as much as, companies have made big efforts to commit to net zero and start implementing transition plans, with 25 years left, there was absolutely no way that we were going to get there. We were going to get all the companies in the world to make a pledge and to implement a credible plan and actually adopt it, and carry it on, materialize, without a little push on policy. And that's where the task force came about. The task force that you actually head the Secretariat. So a lot of people will be surprised why an organization, a network of investors, mainly asset managers and asset owners, is so interested in this space, the policy space, and was happy to host the Secretariat.
Yeah, so investors are not as influential in an individual capacity as you might think. All of that capital combined is very influential, but investors rely on transparency, good information, clear market rules, trust. So you can only be a responsible investor if the market infrastructure, or the plumbing, you might say, is catching up and is helping you make good decisions. And so for the PRI, it's actually part of our mission. It's part of our purpose for being is that we have a sustainable financial system. And to us, that means taxonomies, disclosure laws, target setting, transition planning. These are the things that allow markets to do their job. People who say, oh, don't give us rules, just leave it to the market. It's a false hope. Markets do not exist in nature. Markets are created when we have clear rules and clear objectives. And so this is why it's a critical feature for the PRI.
Thank you, Nathan. I was talking right before about, for me, what has been the key away from our report, right? And I have to say that for someone who spent so much time in Brussels, yeah, on sustainable finance regulation, it was such a, how to say, like what is missing right now, like like fresh of wind, refreshing, coming from the rest of the world. And for me, my takeaway, or what I thought about it, looking at the figures, was, hello, if in Europe we would take the helicopter more often, that helicopter that we all need to take, that take us, give us a perspective of really what's going on in the world, maybe the conversations on policy, even in Brussels, would be, smoother, and they would realize actually what incredible work they did before, and how they inspire, and how they are losing leadership, and how the rest of the world actually is, taking that leadership on. For you, what would be your key takeaway from that report, and what would you say to companies and investors?
So the key takeaway is that we are looking for leadership now in countries like Brazil, in China, in South Korea, on the African continent. There is no, that's this term, hand-wringing, like when you're not really sure what to do, like Europe's having a bit of a moment, like it's a bit unsure. These other countries are showing clear vision and commitment, and I think that's what we're seeing. The policies are being adopted around the world. So over 60% of the world's GDP has some process to adopt the ISSB. 65% of the world's GDP is covered by some taxonomy implementation process. I think we identified 29 substantial transition planning laws and obligations for corporations, and that's more than double what it was even last year. So this tells us that the wave of interest and expectation that markets can be sustainable, that we can get capital to the right places, that idea is a global idea. And Europe had a moment where it thought we can be competitive by being sustainable. Then there was a wobble. But hopefully the level of, like the depth of the commitment we're seeing in these other countries will remind Europe that its competitiveness comes through sustainability, not through fighting it.
Absolutely. And another thing for me, and probably not only from this report, but from the last two, that it became really clear is that at the very beginning, we always talk about green finance, and then we're moving into discussions around transition finance and what are the key tools for transition finance. And my learning, Nathan, that I want to discuss with you is that the two key tools have been taxonomies on one hand, particularly looking at the CapEx side, and transition plans. But before we go into the nitty-gritty of that, I wanted to ask you, because I think it's very important to everyone, would you agree with me if I say CapEx is probably the most important indicator, or one of the most relevant indicators for investors?
Yeah, the reason it matters is because investors care about what companies are doing with their balance sheet. And the most important reason for that is because they want to know if they're going to earn any income as an investor, if there's going to be a dividend. So they monitor this very closely. So they're looking at the cash flows and how much the company reinvests in its own future cash flows. And so this is a fundamental part of being an investor. How much is coming to me? How much is going to the employees? How much is going into the company's assets? So the CapEx gives investors a way to understand whether the strategy is real, whether the transition plan means anything. And so this is why it's a fundamental piece of the disclosure.
Absolutely, because before companies start reporting their CapEx alignment with the taxonomy, what we saw is many companies saying, oh, my CapEx is all aligned with 1.5. And you were saying, okay, great, but where are you investing in? How do I know that it's really aligned? And in fact, I would argue that the most successful thing in Europe when it comes to the taxonomy has been the CapEx investment, because the taxonomy has really guided those CapEx investments. And in June, we already counted more than 800 billion invested in mitigation action. But Nathan, tell us a little bit more what the report says about the taxonomies, the transition plans, that world of transition finance that it's creating.
Yeah. So the report doesn't use this term, but I think you can think of these three tools as the holy trinity. So the ISSB, the corporate disclosures, the taxonomies, and the transition plans. With those components, we have the main things we need for markets to work. Now, that doesn't always mean the incentives are aligned, the real economy pricing signals, or the technology's ready. Those things need to move as well. But for capital markets to function, these really are the holy trinity. And we find that there's really substantial progress globally on these areas. And even in Europe, once it narrows the scope, as in the number of companies that have to report, it will still be a leading jurisdiction on these areas. So I know we often get worried, but it will still be, we still rate it in our top quartile of jurisdictions for financial reform. And that's because some of these things, I think, are quite fundamental and have been accepted.
And what is really important, and sorry for the non-Europeans for the acronym right now, but for what we discover at the Spanish Financial Markets Authority is, despite the fact that the ESRS, the directive that describes what type of sustainability reporting companies need to report on, despite the fact that it hasn't been transposed and now is being reviewed, 78% of all the companies that had to report against the ESRS and have reported voluntarily, because there is an expectation of the market, and we expect companies to continue reporting against them. Would you agree with that?
I think that's right. And investors often like to work behind the scenes. But there's just a basic level of acceptance and analysis on economic disruption because of policies, because of technology, and because of changing demand. We look at other things as well, like geopolitics and trade and physical impacts and these kinds of things. But there's just basically an acceptance that company earnings profiles are going to be volatile because policy is adjusting. And so whether you are somebody who's personally committed to a world with low level of warming or not, it kind of doesn't matter anymore. It's just a fundamental part of allocating money and managing risk. And we in the investment sector have our own transparency obligations now, which track who is competent and who is not. So on the investment side, I think it's all changed.
It's very interesting because over the past few months, I'm seeing, and maybe you may disagree, but I've seen loads of articles and voices saying, oh, disclosures are not delivering, disclosures are not needed, and honestly, for me, it's a little bit, on one hand, well, in many places it is just now that they're being adopted, but also, you know, disclosures is not the end goal. Disclosures is just a means towards something. And you cannot, I mean, I think one of the problems in our area is that we're always looking for the holy grail, yeah? And then the taxonomy is not working because it hasn't sorted the world's problem. You know, disclosures are not working because, you know, it hasn't got us where we need to be, yeah? And actually, and I think this is another key result of the report, is that we need a combination and mix of policies working together and a much more system-wide approach to policy development. Nathan, what are your views on that?
Yeah, that's right. So we think in terms of economic policies, there's a fiscal component to that. So tax incentives and subsidies. We think about the role of trade. We think about sectoral regulation. So performance standards, hard interventions in some sectors. We think even those things we talked about are in the capital market side, but our debt markets work a bit differently and they need some slightly different tools. So you really need to think about how all of these policy levers are working together. And for this, we have a simple ask of governments. Please, it's a top of government issue. It's for the president, it's for the prime minister, because you need a whole of government framework. We know, remember when we were trying to develop criteria in Europe, and we'd have the transport department and the agriculture directorate all fighting their own battles about their current economic circumstances and their stakeholders. And I mean, we worked our way through that, but it's only when the leader comes in and says, no, we're going to get this done, we're going to do this, that you get alignment. And so it's a whole of government issue, but I hope there's no one in the audience who thought disclosure was going to be the silver bullet. It never was. It's like, think of it like the plumbing in your house. If you build a new house, you don't say, oh, I'm not going to put any plumbing in because I only care about sitting in the lounge room. The financial market's like the plumbing. You still need the rest of the house, okay? So we need the plumbing, we need the rest of the house too, but it won't be enough by itself.
Thank you. We're going to go deeper on the different parts of the report during the panel discussion, but I don't want to leave our conversation without pointing out to one last issue. Last year's report, where we did the first time that we did an analysis or assessment of the G20 policies in relation to the HLEC recommendations. Very interestingly, we found out that the two areas where has been less policy development is very interesting on number one, phasing out fossil fuels, and number two, on corporate lobbying, you know? So, surprise, surprise on that one. And very interesting this year, we've seen that there are only two jurisdictions that have set in place disclosures for climate corporate lobbying, and one of them is the EU. And yet, I personally have never seen so much, you know, shameless lobbying by some of the industries, particularly trade associations, such as the German Trade Association, and, you know, industries like the car industry, the heavy industry, and at the same time, what we've seen is the voices of the companies who are progressive, you know, totally shut down, and only the voices of those industries and those companies.
Yeah.
What is going on? Why we're not getting right?
Well, we have democracies, and engagement with policy is a feature of democracies, so we have to be careful about getting rid of that. But we do have a fundamental problem, because the transition is hard enough as it is, and when an incumbent sector weakens the framework, it has a dampening effect for all the other actors. So objectively, we would have to say the system around lobbying is not working. There are two things that investors can do, that my community can do, that will make a difference, but we need more transparency to do it. We own government debt. The bond market has an incredible impact on government thinking. The second thing is we own shares in companies who are lobbying against our interests. And And so it's our responsibility in the investment supply chain for the asset owners, for the investment managers, to align on the objectives and hold the companies to account. But for this, we need more transparency. Otherwise, every company just tells you any story. We've got this great ambition on climate, but they're not clear about what they're asking their investment associations to do, and this harms us. So we need clear information about what's happening in practice with investor associations and how this aligns with company instructions. If we can get that, investors can step in and do their job.
I absolutely agree. I would even go farther. I think that we need to make trade associations properly accountable, and we need to look at the governance structures, not only transparency, but also they need to be put in place, good governance. Maybe they need a code, like companies, of good governance. Now, last
Okay.
question. One of my perceptions sometimes in Brussels is that asset owners' voice, is not really heard, that they're not present. And we hear a lot about the banking industry, we hear the asset managers, but what about the asset owners who are at the end the ones who have the money, right? So what are your thoughts on that? Are we seeing a divide between asset owners and asset managers when it comes to climate?
Yes, so about 30% of global savings belongs to citizen savers in pension funds or insurance funds, and then about another 30% is owned by individuals in their investments. The point is that there's actually more democratic authority in capital markets than you realise. It's just that we've got so many agents who manage the money, and the closer you get to allocating the money to a company, the more closely you are aligned with a company than you are than with each of you. So we've got this big agency problem. Now, asset owners are very influential. They act on behalf of 30%, but they're mostly not for profit, or they're mostly mutuals. So they don't spend. We think asset owners are outspent 20-1 on lobbying activities by companies. Now, I don't think we can fix that equation. But as I was saying in my last response, we are long-term holders of government debt, and we should have more authority in the investment chain so that the agents start to act more in line with your interest. We have not been muscular enough on this, and we have to step it up. We know we have to. So the asset owners have a critical role, a bit more advocacy, a bit more lobbying, but then using the real levers of power that we have as owners on your behalf.
At the end of the day, they manage our pensions and our savings. So we citizens also have to have a say, and we need to question those who manage our future at the end of the day. With that, Nathan, thank you so much. A real pleasure. As always, we could be talking for ages, but we need to move to the next stage of our discussion. And before we move to the panel, I have the real honor to have with us Christina Reis. I need to read your a big of applause to Nathan. Sorry. We know each other far too long.
I'll move.
Christina. Yes. Do you want to sit here? Yes, over there. Sorry. So that way you are center in the camera.
Let me organize myself.
Thank you, Elena. Welcome to Seville in July. Christina, you are, I need to read it because your title is so long. You are Undersecretary of Sustainable Economic Development, the Secretary of Economic Policy in the Ministry of Finance, Brazil. But more than anything, you've been an incredible champion on the Brazilian taxonomy. And what maybe some of the audience don't know is that the Taskforce, besides having a role, an objective of examining the policy development in the areas I was telling you, so how they support companies and financial institutions through transition, one of our also key objectives is to work towards greater convergence, greater interoperability across the world in some of the key tools for transition finance, but also for green finance, being the taxonomy is one of them. And this is why today Christina is joining us. Tell us, Christina, a little bit more for the audience to know why Brazil decided to develop a taxonomy. What was your thinking behind it, the objective? What were you expecting, to get out of it? And thank you for being here.
Thank you, Elena. I will answer this soon, but first I have to apologize because I have the feeling that I invaded the panel. I was walking around searching for this event, then I heard Elena's voice. Elena's voice is strong not only literally because I recognize her speaking, but symbolic because she's so active. She's been fighting for the sustainable finance instruments for so many years. You're certainly an inspiration for us. And then I saw Nathan, and I looked into the panel and said, okay, I am with Nathan in this panel. So why is he alone? I should be next to him because we are partners in anti-crime, right? And we are always also together in this fight. So first of all, I want to congratulate the Taskforce on Net Zero Policy for the COP30 report. And I want to tell you all, as a Brazilian member of the government, to thank you for being here. We apologize for the air conditioner, which is not working, but is saving emissions. And but most of all, for your discipline and your personal engagement into the cause about fighting climate change and promoting sustainable development. We feel really, really honored to have you here in Belém. There is a poet who says that Belém is the homeland of waters. You have seen lots of water, the air is humid. Every day it should rain at 3 o'clock, so watch out. This is a tropical storm, it's common. But the climate change is also changing the rain cycles also. And you saw the river, how special it is to be here, how poor is the city, and how much change we need. And that's the opportunity we seize. My answer to your question on the taxonomy is that we believe that taxonomies are a strategical instrument to redirect investment flows towards sustainable development activities related. So it's not only about adaptation and mitigation, but also about finding the national, sovereign, technological routes and strategic niches that may provide decent job, income generation, inequality, reduce inequality, and protecting, conserving, maintaining, regenerating environments. That's why the Brazilian society has implemented now, last week, a new taxonomy.
Congratulations on that milestone. Woohoo! Excellent. And before we go back to the taxonomy, I wanted one of the areas that we have done dive in the report is carbon credits. And actually now with being in Brazil, it's we all can think about the importance of nature-based credits, and what is the role in sorting out, in protecting, and preserving the Amazon in this case. Can you tell us, Christina, a little bit more about what are the thoughts of the Brazilian government when it comes to nature-based carbon credits and the regulation around it?
Yes, and I have to say that now I'm not the Undersecretary for Sustainable Development anymore. I have become the Secretary for Carbon Markets of the Ministry of Finance in Brazil since last Thursday. But I've been leading this policy here together with the taxonomy, and we see also carbon markets, and I say in plural, as opportunities also to develop markets, to have income generation, and to develop these technological routes related to mitigation. And in Brazil, nature-based solutions are very important. They are strategic, and we are really fighting, I will say this word, to have nature-based solutions considered important for offset usage, for instance, in international carbon markets, because we have really the opportunity to not only to develop projects and programs related to keep forests standing, and I think you know that in Brazil our biggest emission problems is related to land use and deforestation, so we need to avoid deforestation of the Amazon biome, but also of our other 6 biomes. So we have 7 biomes in Brazil, and we need to tackle deforestation of all of them. For instance, Caatinga, which is our desert in the northeast, can capture, say the scientists, 14 times more carbon than the Amazon, the land territory. And then we need to understand how we can develop all these technologies related to carbon capture to carbon removal, carbon reduction, carbon removal. There are many ways to developing carbon credits, and we need to organize this. I can say, and you know this, there is a lot of anxiety related to carbon credits, and in simple words, everybody wants to sell carbon credits here in Brazil, but we need to organize to guarantee the integrity of those credits, and also to develop the demand. And so we need other sustainable finance instruments, such as the taxonomy for this. And listening to Nathan, it reminds me that the sovereign bonds play a very important role. For instance, the Brazilian National Treasury has just issued for the 3rd time sovereign bonds 2 days ago. Everybody's invited to invest, and the resources of the Brazilian sovereign bond is going into the climate fund, which has better financing conditions for the private sector to decarbonize the economy in many sectors, including forests and nature-based solutions. By the way, the interest rate for lending to forest projects of the climate fund is 1%. The regular interest rate in Brazil, unfortunately, I have to say now, is 15%. So you see the difference, how important it is to promote this kind of incentives for developing projects related to mitigation, to adaptation, and other sustainability streams.
Thank you, Christina. One of the things, yes?
Sorry for so long answers. I have so much to say.
Not at all. We're delighted to have you with us, and we're delighted to see how much progress has Brazil done, and the positive energy that we all feel here. We were coming all depressed, well, some of us coming all depressed from Europe, and we are re-energized, yeah? A little bit hot, but re-energized. Christina, one of the things that have surprised me is that you just issue the taxonomy, and yet you picked up from Azerbaijan the leadership on really promoting the taxonomy as a critical tool, as part of the Paris Agreement, Article 2.1c, mobilizing private capital towards sustainable investment, and on the convergence, global convergence. So tell us a little bit more, why is it Brazil, interested in that interoperability at global scale?
Thank you for this question. So last year, during the G20, I had the opportunity to meet Mr. Rustam Tahirov from Azerbaijan, and I heard about the taxonomy roadmap that was about to be launched in the COP29, and of course we've been understanding, studying, researching about taxonomies and experiences of many countries. And when we heard about the taxonomy roadmap, we immediately thought, and by we, I mean the Ministry of Finance, we have to participate to foster this and to already try to combine what they are saying with the way that we are developing our own taxonomy. Interoperability is very important to provide means to compare taxonomies, not to standardize or not to make a global taxonomy. Is not about this, but really to make clear to the investors how the taxonomies can vary, the importance of them to vary because they correspond to sovereign national development choices, but that they can be compared so that you can understand what means sustainability, or a green activity in every country, and then the investors can prioritize, we hope, this kind of activities. Interoperability is a very big word. That's why we are just simplifying and saying super taxonomy here, our super T.
Big name.
And Brazil is supporting this, and we believe that the principles that were just launched, and I had the honor to be there in São Paulo. I congratulate every person and institution that contributed to the report on interoperability principles, can be negotiated under Article 2.1c, as you said, among all countries. That's our hope during this year of the Brazilian presidency of COP30, and we hope the next presidencies will continue this work.
Brilliant. We really, really hope that the Super T makes it to this year's agreement. We really thank you, Christina, not only for being here with us today, but for all the work, all your energy behind this file. And I look forward to seeing you next year, for the next step of the Super T. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Elena, and one last thing. I don't know if you all have seen the report from Baku to Belém, the 1 trillion. There is a page talking about the principles of interoperability. It's there. You haven't seen this? It's all. No, it's already there. It's a priority for the Brazilian presidency. It's there, and the Ministry of Finance has commented, and also the President Lula is talking about the taxonomy and the Super T. So congratulations.
Thank you so much. We'll bring all those news to Europe back with us. Thank you, Christina. And if I may ask our panelists to please join me on stage, we have. And I will be introducing you one by one. Okay. Mathilde Messner, Deputy Director for the Environment of the OECD. Igor Ponovic, Senior Economist and Chief of the Climate and Development Strategy Unit at UNCTAD. They're both members of our board of the Taskforce on Net Zero Policy. And then to my right, Thomas Hale from the Oxford Climate Policy Hub and member of the Taskforce. And then Jacopo Benzini from the European University Institute, the School of Transnational Governance. Yes, I wrote it wrong. Expert on carbon credits, who's not a member of the task force, but represents one of key partnerships we had this year for the report with the European University Institute. Also, like last year, actually, Tom, not only you are a member, but you've been a very special partner with us, for us, since the very beginning. And I will start with you, Tom. Maybe you can tell us a little bit, very briefly, you can tell the audience, how, apologies, how you got, about the survey on policy, on policy development. The Taskforce on Net Zero Policy uses the data from the Oxford Monitor, Climate Monitor, Climate Policy Monitor, to feed that it feeds into the task force and our report. So maybe Tom, you can explain very briefly how it works.
Happily. Well, first, Elena, congratulations. Nathan, congratulations. The whole task force team, I think, has put in another huge year of effort and has resulted in a really hard-hitting report. So if you haven't had a chance to download it and read it yet, please go to the website, download it, put it next to your bed so you can wake up in the middle of the night and refer to it. It's really, really good reading. And we're delighted at Oxford to be a partner with you in this exciting endeavor again. Look, implementation requires hard work and it requires detail. One of the things that we need to help governments to implement climate policy is an evidence base that is equally detailed and equally in depth to actually allow action to take place, to allow implementation to take place. How do you collect information about dozens of different policy areas across dozens of different countries, literally hundreds and hundreds of different instruments, all in their own context, all with their own complications? You need to mobilize a huge expert network for that. And for this report, we're drawing on a fantastic network of law firms from the Oxford Climate Policy Monitor who spend hundreds, if not thousands of hours each going in great detail into not just what the policies say, but also how they're implemented, how the different actors are covered by them, how they're enforced, etc. And so the evidence base we're looking at here, which we're summarizing the very tip of today, is actually really deep.
Thank you, Tom. One of the areas that your survey covers, and then the task force has done a real deep dive, it's on transition plans and transition financing, transition planning elements. Could you tell the audience, what the results of the survey said about the G20 policy developments in this area and even beyond?
It's a really important area. As Elena and Nathan were just saying, a lot of the media narrative on transition planning has looked a lot at one jurisdiction and one rule, Europe's CSDDD, which is of course important. Europe is 6 or 7% of global emissions, so it really matters. But if you look beyond Europe and you look across the world, you see in the last 12 months 50 new instruments on transition planning around the world. So yes, one is a little bit, we're unclear where it's going to land, but 50 new ones have arisen. And I want to point to a few of the key examples that maybe are not on people's monitors. In Rwanda, in the African Union, a member of the G20, we see a new transition plan for banks requiring them to publish targets they've set. Australia has a new Net Zero Economy Act, which has more sectoral plans, including, for example, just transition planning requirements for fossil fuel sectors. So there's a lot going on. And if you look at what's driving this, I think a lot of it is going back to standards. So the ISSB standard coming into place has been taken up by a number of different places, and this is really important because it talks about interoperability. And with new standards coming online like the International Organization and others stepping into the space, we need to see that cohesion coming together.
One of the things, at least for me, that I learned last year in our report, and this year came out even more strongly, is that there's almost like two approaches, right? There's the more classical approach, let's call it, which is, the disclosure of a transition plan, and then that Europe went a step farther with behavioral regulation and making them compulsory to adopt and implement, which is right now, under review, but it looks like, it's going to still, stay. Not the implementation, but definitely the adoption. And now, I think the language now is something around, implementing some actions towards, towards that goal. But there are other countries around the world that are really interesting as part of the real economy policies or their climate policy or even energy policy require companies to set emission target reductions and then to develop a transition plan for that. So a different approach, which is more, part of the real economy policy, which I find quite interesting.
Exactly right. So I think if you look across the G20, you see very common requirements on disclosing targets and plans if you have them, for developing targets and plans, also very common, and then for sort of saying what the plan should contain, a lot more vagueness, right? So there's a lot of impetus toward doing this, but still I think governments are largely hesitant to say too much in particular about by this date you must achieve this kind of thing. And where I think we have real scope to grow is on, also as we discussed before, success factors like is capital expenditure, capex required to be disclosed or part of a plan? Do you need to have interim targets? Those are the kinds of things where I think we have room to strengthen. I just want to shout out one of the transition planning rules, which this is more in this real economy space you mentioned, Elena, that is actually, I think, a really strong model. And you probably haven't heard of it before. It's the Green Tug Transition Plan from India, where it's very targeted. It's about diesel tugboats, which are, one important but not very massive sector of the economy. But this plan, this transition planning rule, has all the features. It has quantitative targets. It has strict rules on capital expenditure. It has strict rules on timetables. It has strict rules on accountability. So it really shows that India, in this case, in one sector, has been able to create a very high, robust plan, Green Tug Transition Plan. So forget CSDDD, look at GTTP.
I would even encourage everyone to also look at Japan's approach. And South Africa has also a really interesting approach. You will find all about it in our report. But let me move to Mathilde. Obviously, what is a credible transition plans and the policies around it is at the very core of the task force, because that was the very core of the H leg. But the OECD has done a lot of work on what is a credible transition plan. Can you tell us a little bit more what is a credible transition plan and what sort of policies are needed?
Okay. So in our view, I have my own holy trinity, to make sure that policies lead to credible transition plans. And this holy trinity is, of course, disclosure and transparency first. Second, it's monitoring accountability. And third is the enabling environment. So let me go to each of these points. On disclosure and transparency, we have moved, now the message is very clear in the report. What we need to have is first mandatory disclosure. So that's something we keep repeating, but it's not yet everywhere. And also, of course, alignment with the international standards and the ISS-based standards. So that's very important. And so that we can ensure that we move from transition plans that are kind of commitments, sometimes vague commitments, to really decision-useful plans and credible. And also we need to move from, not only saying which target you have in terms of emissions, but how you calculate your targets, which methodologies you use, etc., which scenarios you have built, etc. So we need to be able to not only assess through these transition plans the ambitions, but their feasibility, and their credibility. So the second point, and that's where it's more like the cutting-edge discussion, it's on accountability, on governance. And we have, as you said, OECD guidance on transition finance. And there, what we say is that there are two key words here in terms of accountability. They need to be embedded in all the company's processes. Of course, reporting processes, but also risk management processes and governance processes. So that's the first key word, embeddedness. The second one is you have regular reporting on progress. Not good enough to say, I will do that in 2035, but my regular reporting on progress will make it credible or not, whether I'm moving in the right direction. And you need to report to all your internal governance bodies, like the board, the shareholders, and then to the public authorities that are relevant to do that. So once again, the idea is that we move from aspirations to decision-useful transition plans and credible ones. And the last point, it's enabling environment, so it's much broader. And that's where we are currently working at DOC. Like, what are the more coherent policy environments to ensure that these transition plans means something in terms of a real transition. So watch it. You'll hear more from us soon on that.
It's very interesting because one of the disclosures asked of the ESRS and the TPT as well, it's on the policy externalities, right? So what are those bottlenecks that companies find in different jurisdictions that sort of it's a block, it's a challenge or a barrier for companies to extend. So in the report, one of the areas that we really deep, it's on the need for different jurisdictions to develop sectorial roadmaps, policy sectorial roadmaps, together with the technological policy that would help companies to then sit down and start having that conversation between, this policy is actually, a real barrier for me, how can we move forward, yeah? But we need those sectorial policy roadmaps that are based on one hand on science, but at the same time on the policy framework. And we believe also that it will really help them to look at more strategic, all the policies within a jurisdiction and look at the inconsistencies across, because that's a real problem for companies and financial institutions. Igor, moving away because we are, time flies, one of our conclusions last year was that although there was increasingly more consciousness among countries and policymakers were more aware of the importance of adaptation, nature, and just transition, it was very few policies, particularly in the area that we're talking about, that systematically integrated resilience, nature, and just transition, right, into the mitigation policies. So this year report, we decided to do a deep dive to look a little bit more in detail about that. Could you tell us, Igor, a little bit what are the key recommendations, that we make, what does the report say, and particularly around climate resilience, where unfortunately, attracts much less financing, than mitigation. Not that it needs to be in detriment of mitigation. Igor.
Thank you very much, Helena. And I apologize, I just came this night, so I will have to read from my notes to be
We're just very pleased you're here
coherent. Yeah, thank you.
Had a sleepless night.
So I think basically we are recognizing that climate resilience is no longer optional. It's essential, and as climate impacts intensify, adaptation, finance, and resilience strategies must be embedded into every aspect of climate policy. But yet, as we know, current adaptation finance flows are 8 to 14 times below the needs. So that's an order of magnitude below what we actually need. So unfunded and fragmented. And why it matters. Without resilience, mitigation efforts risk being undermined by physical climate impacts. Especially vulnerable communities, ecosystems, and economies are at risk. So resilience helps protect lives, livelihood, and infrastructure, and reducing the long-term costs for all of us. So our recommendations are, first of all, integrate resilience into policy frameworks, embed adaptation, nature, and just transition into disclosures, taxonomies, and transition plans. But also include some specific elements into regulatory frameworks, like robust risk assessments, do no significant harm safeguards, alignment with national plans, and early and meaningful stakeholder engagement. Without that, it's not going to be possible to include resilience into our climate actions. Of course, taxonomies, as we already heard, are very important, so we have to develop eligible activity lists for investment in climate adaptation and resilience, nature, and just transition, so that we know what a credible investment in resilience is. We also need interoperability, which we already talked about, should be provided to support cross-border flows to resilience investments. But also in the real economy policies, we have to continue the development of real economy policies aiming to support private sector investment in resilience. focusing on regulatory coherence, inclusive implementation, and support for capacity building. So to attract private investment, actually we need an iterative and dynamic policy development, strategic planning, policy coherence, regulatory alignment, insurance and risk transfer, together with public finance and investment. So I would say the bottom line is we must move beyond mitigation-only frameworks and build systems that protect people, nature, and economies in the long term.
Thank you, Igor. It was very interesting in June when we examined, we started in June, actually March, when the European Platform Sustainable Finance, we start looking at, start monitoring capital flows in Europe, and we saw those 800 billion that I was telling you of capex investments in line with the taxonomy. Very little was actually invested in resilience, in adaptation. However, a closer look showed that one of the reasons is that probably we didn't capture all the investments, because for companies it's very, very difficult to split what part was actually part of resilience as opposed to renovation or other type of investments. They were usually, going hand in hand with other type of investments, so it was really difficult, right, to report only on adaptation. So bottom line, we're still, companies in Europe are still not investing sufficiently in adaptation, but more than we have tracked. Now, moving on to on the report, Mathilde, one of you know that it is absolute. You can have an incredible policy framework, but if you don't enforce it, if there's no real accountability mechanisms, it's of little use to a certain extent. So in the report this year, we also, and we partnered with the University of Melbourne, we also did a deep dive on accountability mechanisms, right? So what type of policies are, policymakers across the G20 and beyond putting in place precisely to ensure integrity of climate data, apologies, and of integrity of transition plans.
Yeah, so you allow me to deep dive a bit into my second element of the Holy Trinity, accountability. And there is a significant movement towards asking for more assurance, more information, more monitoring, more assurance. But it's still, the landscape is still very much uneven. And it depends on the jurisdictions and it depends on the topics. So of course the topics of carbon emission is the one where there are more requests for assurance, verification, third-party verification, etc. And there is progress in terms of jurisdictions. And if in the report it shows that in the past year alone, a lot of jurisdictions have adopted, disclosure requirements asking these to be verified. And if I list these jurisdictions, it really illustrates what you told us. It's that the geography is moving, from Europe and the US southward and eastward. It's Australia, Brazil, Japan, Mexico, Nigeria, Turkey, and California. So apart from California, there is no one single European country. I mean, of course, there are more advanced on that already. So this is very important.
1 second on this. I think very often, sorry, just very quickly because it's important, we forget that California is the 4th biggest economy in the world, and actually they have really progressive policies in this area. Sorry to interrupt you, but I thought it's really important that we highlight, there is a part of the US that is still on course.
So basically, we see progress. It's uneven. It's led by non-European and apart from California, non-North American countries, so that's an interesting point. And we have Australia here, because we might be in Australia next year, that has a very interesting new legislation or regulation, I'm not sure, that looks for phasing in, this transition planning, but with a clear requirement that by 2030 the sustainability report should be audited. So that's ambition. So I think this could be an inspiration for other jurisdictions. In our, our OECD guidance, we request for credible transition plan, we request third-party verification of transition plans. We don't request, we recommend, basically. But we know that that's where the next battle is, making sure that we have a reasonable degree of assurance that what's in the transition plan and what is reported against the transition plan is real. Voilà.
Absolutely. And you just made me think that in Europe we had reasonable assurance. Well, as part of the reporting requirements, what the directive said that is at the very beginning, so now companies should seek limited assurance, and by 2028 move to reasonable assurance. But the news coming from Brussels says that we're going to drop reasonable assurance. But very interestingly, Mexico has picked it up and said, no, we will go for reasonable assurance. So once again, we're seeing that, that sort of inevitable sort of shift towards, well, in this case, towards West. But, one of the things that we really looked into more detail in the report, Mathilde, it's carbon locking. In fact, we partnered with you, yes, and it was the OECD has done incredible work around carbon locking. And for a lot of the audience would say, well, why, dedicating one chapter exclusively to carbon locking? So Mathilde, can you explain us, first of all, what is carbon locking?
Yeah. So carbon locking, really, it refers to the persistence of fossil fuel-based assets, even in the case where you have cheaper technologies that are available for the transition. And this is due basically to the long lifespan of these fossil fuel assets, and thus to the sunk cost. So even if you have cheaper technology, you want to use at maximum your existing assets. And even there are solutions here to get out of this carbon locking. You can retrofit, you can repurpose, you can do efficiency upgrades, etc. And everything, is discussed. It's not easy, but it's doable. But this is a critical topic because avoiding carbon locking might be as important as basically achieving near-term mitigation targets. And that's what we say in an OECD and IEA analysis. Because already the existing and planned assets, fossil fuel assets, they are already using all our carbon budgets. So if we enter into new ones, we know that we are out of, the Paris Agreement. So it's a critical risk for the Paris target. So that's something we really need to focus on. And again and again, we cannot allow to lock us in new fossil fuel assets. It's as important to avoid this locking than to run after more mitigation, etc. It's kind of the basic objective that we should have.
You're absolutely right. Carbon locking is absolutely critical. And it's very interesting because sometimes there's a confusion with the stranded assets, yeah? And stranded assets are a totally different piece, right? Stranded asset is when a high emitting asset, the value is devaluated because of climate transition, normally because of climate transition policies. Now, if I may, stranded assets are really important as a risk management, like to deal with stranded assets is what you do when you do risk management. And here is where the main difference for me comes on double materiality as opposed to financial materiality. Financial materiality deals with the stranded assets, but not with carbon lock-in. Carbon lock-in is the impact side of double materiality, and this is why it's so important, as good as it is, to have as a first step, financial materiality in reporting. We need to move forward towards both financial and materiality. But Mathilde, what do we say? What are the recommendations that we provide in the report when it comes to carbon locking. What type of policies have we seen and what type of policies we will recommend to deal with carbon locking?
We have three policies. I'm French, so you know I like to structure things in 3 points. So the first one is for government to adopt regulatory measures that explicitly limit the lifetime of high-emitting assets, and such as, for example, the phase-out mandates. So really, we need to have binding deadlines there for retiring these high-emission assets. And so, for example, the UNHLA recommend no new coal mines or power points and immediate cessation of coal reserve expansion by 2030 to avoid dislocking. And we need policy tools such as sunset clauses in permits, mandatory decommissioning, manage exit programs, etc. The second point that is very important is, and that is described in the report, is we'd like to see an expansion of the do not significant harm principle, and that's quite important. And so that this principle is extended to a wider set of public investments. Sorry, I should speak more like. So, so that's one key recommendation of the report also. And the third point is that for governments to establish safeguards to ensure that short-term fuel transition do not create new forms of carbon locking. So that's also, because that's the risk. You know, we're having all these interesting discussions on from coal to gas, etc. So what we need to make sure is that when we do so, okay, we improve the immediate mitigation, but we don't lock in for the long term into still like fossil fuel assets.
So once again, the real importance of CapEx moving forward, so we make sure that there's no new investments on oil and gas, but also that the investments, you know, integrate, you know, the avoidance of carbon locking, and we don't end up paying twice, right? Tom, I'm going to turn to you because methane, you know, has a big potential, right? Can bring forced carbon locking. In the survey, you know, you did dive in on methane policies and regulations across the G20 and beyond. Can you tell us a little bit the results of that survey?
Yeah, so methane is a really important area for policymaking in a world which sadly we now understand is moving into an overshoot territory, moving past the 1.5 degree goal. Because methane's effect on the climate is much more powerful than carbon dioxide on a molecule-to-molecule basis, but also much more short-lived. So if you bring down methane emissions today, you really affect the temperature in the near term, which is what we need to do to reduce overshoot as much as possible. Methane comes from oil and gas, through leakage and flaring. It comes from coal. It comes from agriculture. And it comes from waste. We don't look at waste in the report because often waste policy is managed at the local level, but those other areas are often subject to national rules and regulations. And what we see is, encouragingly, methane policy has really taken off in the last few years. So if you look back to 2020 and look toward today, you see like 80% increase in the number of policies targeting methane. So we're seeing a lot of good growth in this area. Most of that growth is actually happening on oil and gas in particular. So leakage, pipelines leaking, and flaring. And so this is an important area, but it shows that there's other areas of the methane problem where policy needs to go faster. And here I want to put my finger directly onto agriculture. Agriculture is the area where policy development has remained fairly soft and fairly weak compared to oil and gas methane leakage. And the reason for that is, of course, not hard to understand. Agriculture is arguably more complicated. You know, oil and gas is a very targeted sector. The solutions are quite incentive compatible in that you're basically wasting less stuff, and so companies can use existing technology to make the changes they need, and sometimes even make more money doing that instead of losing money. So it's easier politics and simpler problem. But we really need to get ahead of the agricultural problem. Most of the policies we see on agriculture are not of the sticks, they're more carrots, so providing positive incentives to agricultural groups to try things like capturing biogas for energy generation or switching feedstocks or other kinds of moves like that. Even here, though, there's a lot of very vague policies. So, say my own country, the United States, has an agricultural methane plan, but it's very high level. It doesn't have specific funding streams or targets or other kinds of things. Australia actually is an example of a country that has a small scale but quite, I think, well-designed livestock reduction program, which has grants for very quantified outcomes. So there's a lot we can learn even within the carrot realm. So yeah, methane we need to do more on. Oil and gas, for better or worse, has a more regular, a more developed framework around it, including in places you might find surprising. Saudi Arabia has a very emergingly technically sophisticated program on this. Needs to do more on enforcement, but has a very well-designed kind of technical framework. Whereas I think the agricultural sector is where we need to grow more.
Thank you so much, Tom. What I haven't shared yet with the audience is that the report is basically divided into 4 parts, or there are like 4 areas that we have done a dive in. Transition planning with the sectoral roadmaps, the carbon lock-in, and then the lobbying piece. But we are not going to touch upon that because we have a special event here at the Spanish Pavilion on, remind me, on Thursday 13. So if you're interested in that, come along us. Hopefully the air condition will be sorted by then. And then we have another area that we did a deep dive is resilience, nature and just transition. Then the third one is carbon credits, and the fourth one, accountability. On accountability, we're having a special event at the Pavilion of Australia, also on Thursday. So that leaves us with carbon credits, which is the last topic that we're going to discuss now. So, Jacopo, for the audience, what is exactly a carbon credit? Give us a snapshot of what is a carbon credit. What are the key challenges, and particularly around the claims, and now, what is it, can we consider a high integrity or high quality carbon credit? And I recall everyone that is more important now than ever, because the EU has just announced the 2040 goals, 90% reduction, but with a 5% of flexibility. And this time, Europe has said, yes, that 5% would be on the international trading of carbon credits, right? Would be filled by international credits. So, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Helena, and congratulations to the whole of the Taskforce for the publication of the report. Also, on behalf of my colleagues at the UI, Jos Delbeke, Piotr Dombrovitsky, it's been a pleasure working together. To start with an image that I had in the morning, I accessed the venue while there was a protest from civil society with banners saying no to carbon markets. And there I thought about the words used last year in the final decision of the COP, where it was said that to mobilize finance towards climate finance goal overall, all actors should have been involved. And then I was thinking, who are those? Who are those actors? And in that, all actors, which juridically speaking couldn't say much, let's say, then we have the investments which could be made by private entities, by public entities, buying those credits, those offsets, those units. Different names for different end users, of course, but basically, the carbon credit is a standardized unit of 1 ton of metric CO2 removed, avoided, or a reduction of CO2 in a specific sector through a specific methodology. Those are tradable instruments. It's something that companies and other actors have been purchasing and exchanging for more than 20 years now, since the establishment of the Kyoto Protocol at that time. And it's a sector which developed over the years, also in absence of higher guidance, if you want, from the UN. Now, since last year in Baku, we're in a totally different situation. Things are evolving, but we can say that we're still in between the spirit of climate cooperation, a spirit which is rooted in the idea that there could be cost-effective ways to implement climate action beyond what you can already do with your own emissions, and offsetting, which is a way to actually address the emissions coming from your own activity. The voluntary market for carbon credits in recent years has been falling down since the scandals of 2023. We're now under $1 billion globally in terms of volume of the primary market, but I already made at least one mistake in saying this, because we're talking about markets, as a plural, and I really appreciate the intervention of the Brazilian colleague earlier on this, and we are seeing new actors coming to the field. We are seeing rating agency, we are seeing new developers, and in that sense the market is really changing. A carbon credit from the Kyoto Protocol from 20 years ago is not a carbon credit of today in most cases. When it comes to integrity of those credits, and integrity is one of the big words of the era we're living, we're talking about whether this credit, whether this reduction or removal is additional to policies already existing, whether this credit is durable, whether this reduction or removal is durable in time, which is really linked to the long problems we are facing in terms of how we are addressing climate change from a policy point of view. How do we address the possibility of leakage of those that stored CO2? How do we set baselines? How do we set MRV systems? This is how, along the production of a credit, along the value chain, let's say, of the production of a credit, you can assess integrity. And in this absence of multilateral guidance since 2015 with the Paris Agreement, until the completion of the rules last year under Article 6.4, actors, multi-stakeholder initiatives have tried to address those challenges through selective approaches by trying to understand which kind of credits, which type of credits should we use for each different end use. Whether it was the case, for instance, also to insert clauses to stop at some point and just accept credits with a vintage which is younger than a specific number. Credits from 20 years ago, from projects originating credits without any methodology, or a few methodologies 20 or 15 years ago, perhaps are not of good use at the moment anymore for the integrity issues we were just mentioning. The SBTI, GRI have been setting standards in that sense, also when it comes to removal credits, and I think we'll discuss that later, also in terms of tracking additionality, which is still a problem. Now we're talking about durability, mostly, when it comes to challenges, integrity problems. When it comes to additionality, it's not easy to understand, even nowadays, whether a certain policy, a certain project is additional to what was already in paper. In that sense, I would say that it's also very important to have some points to navigate this new map when we're talking about what carbon credits are. First of all, there could be no carbon credit in 2025, 2026, which doesn't take into account social and environmental safeguards. Otherwise, we will fall again into the trap of the big mistakes made in the past in this sector, which is also the reason why the sector is now fragmented, whether we are seeing a bifurcation based on quality, integrity, based on whether, I took note of what Nathan said at the beginning, whether this credit is real, whether it makes a difference. Sorry to reuse and change slightly your wording. Now there's a huge push, political, towards CDR, towards carbon dioxide removal, which is not yet matched with investment volumes, price premium, for instance, but that's a good direction to walk. So I would think that from this report on, from these events on here at COP30, we can really restart discussing carbon credits in a different way.
And you would agree with me that now, you know, the holy grail in a way will be to really define and get it right. What is a high quality, high integrity carbon credit, right? So before we move to the policy regulation around carbon credits, I want to ask you, Igor, about why carbon credits, and particularly integrity, and what does it mean for the most vulnerable countries and least developed countries are so important?
Well, thank you very much for that question. Carbon credits can be an important tool for financing climate action in LDCs and vulnerable countries because they often host rich ecosystems and have significant potential for nature-based solutions like reforestation and sustainable agriculture. So they can generate carbon credits. But without strong regulation, carbon markets could do more harm than good. The report shows that only a small fraction of policies currently require benefit sharing or social integrity criteria, and this is really a major gap. So without appropriate safeguards, like risk reinforcing this situation in LDCs can reinforce existing inequalities and expose countries to additional social and environmental pressures. So recommendations for this big part of the international community, which is not actually economically so important, but many people live in these countries, is first of all, we need high integrity standards if we are going to push this specific instrument to be of value for LDCs and vulnerable countries. As we said already, we need additionality, permanence, transparency, and importantly, a third-party verification. Because without monitoring and verification, you cannot have high integrity credits. The second recommendation is that we have to embed human rights protection. We need free, prior, and informed consent for indigenous peoples, ensure that benefit can come to those who are affected on the ground and not just to international investors. And for that, we need inclusive governance. We have to try to co-design projects with local communities from the start, because if we don't include them, or we include them at the end of the process, they will not be stakeholders in the process. They will probably not benefit from that process. So if we don't do that, we will not actually do any good for them. So the last point I think worth mentioning is that this can and should come on top of the existing multilateral obligations on official development assistance and NCQG commitments, so that we actually combine all these different streams of finance for the most vulnerable and the LDCs.
You're absolutely right. I think that one of the things that the report makes very, very clear is that while carbon credits, if we get them right and they are high quality, high integrity, can be a source of finance, it cannot be a substitute for all the climate finance that has been committed, and that it should go irrespectively of carbon credits. And the same goes a little bit with nature-based solutions, right? So carbon credits can help, but they shouldn't be the only tool or the only, right? And we go back to the very beginning where we say we need to move away from this idea of one tool is the holy grail or the solution for everything. We need different combination of tools and policies. So talking about policy, Tom, can you give us a little bit of overview of the regulation that the G20 and beyond countries have been put in place in terms of carbon credits? Because there's been a lot of development over the last year, hasn't it?
There absolutely has, and as others have said, this is an area that has been crying out for good, fair, standard regulation across the world. I think, Nathan, you said, markets don't exist in nature. They need rules to create them, and this market in particular needs clarity. So here's the big prize. The good news is regulation is growing really quickly in this space. Actually, the different areas we track, this sees the most growth since 2020, and a lot of growth even last year, with new rules coming into place in places that include India, China, Nigeria, and Brazil, as the Undersecretary was just mentioning. So it's growing fast. In terms of quality, there's some good parts and some parts that need more work, I'd say. So a lot of these new rules talk about creating an exchange or using an existing exchange so we don't have a double counting problem. That's kind of a core feature of making the market work. A lot of them, nearly 2/3, have some additional provisions around the additionality requirement to make sure they are real new things, not just things that would have happened otherwise. Two areas where more growth is needed, I would say, are on the reversibility or durability equation. So making sure that if carbon credit doesn't deliver on what it needs because, say, the forest is affected in some way or some other problem occurs, there's a mechanism to deal with that. You see examples of this, for example, in buffer pools, so regulations in Japan, or in Australia have a kind of additional buffer of an extra set of credits that have to be created to make a more conservative assumption about not all of them may make it to the result they're trying to achieve. But only about half of regulations have something on this durability permanence question. And then finally, the area that Igor mentioned that's so critical, and also Jacopo, you mentioned this, social safeguards. Only 12 jurisdictions have, for example, a requirement that there is free prior informed consent for people living near, especially nature-based projects. So that has to change. That's a really important part of getting this right. And actually, in this realm, it's the African countries that have been adopting policies in the space that show the highest level of quality in the regulation on this consideration. So, for example, in Nigeria, which I mentioned, there's a requirement that for a nature-based policy, 40% of the revenue post-cost that goes from that project has to be given over to the local community. So that's a really clear regulation that's showing actually this has to work for the people around it if it's going to work for anyone.
Thank you, Tom. Jacopo, one of the areas within the carbon credit section that we really look a little bit more into detail is carbon removals, the new kid on the block. It's the net of the net zero. And particularly now, I mean, it was always really going to be really important, right, for dealing with residual emissions. But now, with the overshoot, they're going to be even more important because we need to bring temperatures back to 1.5 as quickly as possible. So could you tell us a little bit, walk us through what are the different types of carbon removal credits, how the development, how advanced it is, and a little bit like the policies around it.
Thank you, Helena. When it comes to removing carbon to the atmosphere, it's been a debated and heated topic for many years because, of course, many, especially from civil society, were advocating reductions first, which we also agree with in terms of when the Paris Agreement started, it was immediately urgent to steer down the curve of emissions. Now, we also have to add to that idea the fact that beyond 2040 and mainly 2050, we will have to keep the temperature low. And the only way to do that is to store the carbon that we are able to remove when it comes to excess emissions, if you allow me. CDR credits, polarized division, sorry to use a strong word at the moment, but that's the direction the political debate is going, between nature-based credits and technology-based credits. When it comes to nature-based, it's a sector that we all know very well. Since decades, we talk about afforestation, reforestation, soil carbon sequestration, technologies which are being developed at the moment and at very advanced stage. And when it comes to niche technologies, we can also mention ocean-based solutions, which are in the nascent stages. When it comes to technology-based solutions, there's a great hype around them at the moment, as I said earlier, not matched with a sufficient volume of investment and research and development to grow those at the necessary scale. Towards 2015, we talk about direct air capture, for those of you who went to Iceland, for instance, to see some applications, to California in the United States. We're talking about bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. We're talking about biochar, and it's plenty of good panels here at COP30 about that actually. The main difference between the two types relies in how do you store the CO2 and for how long. When it comes to nature-based solutions, the CO2 is stored by the ecosystem itself, or the ecosystem you are rebuilding, or the ecosystem you are saving somehow. And in that sense, it's a short-term to medium-term solution because, of course, that ecosystem has a life cycle, and you have to maintain that storage over time, and that could be put in danger by exogenous variables such, for instance, as a fire, burning a forest. And of course, methods have been developed over the years to tackle that. When it comes to technology-based solutions, then the CO2 is stored mainly and most often geologically. It's a long-term storage, which is with its pros and cons, of course, but it's long-term storage with very low risks of reversals. As you can already imagine, a great difference between the two sectors lays in pricing, in how these technologies actually cost at the moment. And we have prices for technology-based solutions which could be from 100 times to even more compared to nature-based ones. And here, and I stop because I see we're running out of time, but pricing is a key issue also in this subsector in carbon markets, because as it is impossible at the moment to have investors actually willing to fund technologies as DAC, direct air capture, where you can have credits costing $400, $500, $600 per ton. So you need public intervention to actually steer those prices down, and research and development. And on the other hand, you cannot have old forest credits sold for $1 on the international market.
Thank you, Jacopo. Very quickly, one last question. We are at the COP. We cannot, leave the conversation of carbon credits without talking about, the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Can you summarize it for us and tell us your expectations for this COP on that?
Well, the old idea behind Article 6 was to revive the clean development mechanism from the Kyoto Protocol in a better way, involving all countries and trying to involve both bilateral cooperation, international cooperation, and non-market approaches. But when it comes to Article 6.2 and 6.4, we're talking about what countries can do with those, and allow me for being imprecise here, with those credits, indeed, with those units. Last year at COP29, quite surprisingly, we got to an agreement on rules under Article 6.4, and that means that we have the first basic set of rules to see new credits flowing, and those rules are addressing all the challenges we've been mentioned before, and there has been a huge debate over the past weeks under the Article 6.4 supervisory body on some of the key issues, such, for instance, for how long should a post-crediting monitoring system last after the emission of the credits, after credit has been created. And those are really heated topics. What we expect from the supervisory body, the methodological panel over the next few months, is to develop a system under which we can be sure that UN labeled credits, if you allow me, are safe enough to invest. And then there's also Article 2, where countries are free to negotiate between them bilateral agreements to exchange this kind of, again, allow me to be imprecise, credits, units for removed CO2 or avoided CO2. But that there's more freedom, but at the same time, we need to keep an eye on minimum rules to have this market going with true impact. And just to close, we've been talking about avoidance and avoidance credits. The discussion on avoidance has been postponed at the UN level until 2028. So everything we're talking about when it comes to Article 6 is mainly reduction and CO2 removal.
Thank you, Jacopo. So it's a space to watch, right? To keep
Definitely.
an eye on, definitely. I was about to close the panel, but I couldn't, and I know that you've been sitting here in this sauna that has become the Spanish pavilion for quite a long time now, but I didn't want to conclude without bringing Bill Hare to the panel and asking him a couple of questions, because Bill Hare, for those who do not know, is not only the founder and the CEO of Climate Analytics, but he was the lead author of the IPCC fourth assessment report. He was a colleague, in the HLEC, and he's a task force member. So, Bill, I talked at the very beginning about that the overshoot is now inevitable. Please tell us, explain to us, what is the science behind, what it really implies.
Thanks. Let's hope everyone can hear me. Unfortunately, due to the lack of action the last decade, so many emissions have not reduced like they should have. Emissions remain high, and we'll hear in a few days they're even higher this year than last year. And that's meant that even if you could reduce emissions by 50% by 2030 from where we start now, you would bust through the 1.5 degree warming level on a 20 or 30-year average by the early 2030s, okay? So that means that there has been a major political failure to act, and that is why the Secretary General said that we're heading towards overshoot. We're not at overshoot yet, but it's becoming pretty inevitable. So what that means that we need to deal with it, and we know from the way that the science is going, and I just came from a panel at the Planetary Science Pavilion on tipping points this morning, which is very scary. We need to limit that overshoot as strictly as possible, right? And that means that all efforts need to go into that. If we don't limit overshoot as close as possible to 1.5 degrees, then we're risking a literal explosion of damages all around the world. There's a lot of talk at this COP about resilience and adaptation, but I tell you what, the science tells us that the warmer you get, every 1/10 of a degree above 1.5, the harder, slower, more difficult and less reliable adaptation becomes for many countries, many sectors and many systems. So don't bet on that. Now, as a consequence, we need to recalibrate and we need to work on ensuring that emission reductions get to be fast enough to limit peak warming as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. I mean, we've just published a study last week which shows that if you adopted the highest possible ambition, peak warming could be limited, let's say, between 1.65 and 1.7, in round terms, 1.7 degrees. I think the International Energy Agency will be showing similar results tomorrow. So it's possible. And that means that we also need to focus on getting to net zero CO2 as fast as possible. If there's one science fact people need to take away from this process, given that warming is continuing unabated at 0.3 degrees per decade, is that we simply have to get to net zero CO2 globally as fast as possible, because then we will halt the warming. Getting to net zero greenhouse gas emissions later means warming will drop from that peak level.
Bill, somehow, unfortunately, science seems to be out of fashion in the world, yeah? Somehow it has fallen and we no longer pay attention to science. So as a scientist, what would be your one message to our audience today and the one message to negotiators who are right now, right here, negotiating the...
Yeah, look, thanks. I'm afraid I'm going to add some fairly dissonant messages to what you've just heard the last hour and a half, right? Net zero is a geological or geophysical concept. We have to do that net CO2 globally and net zero greenhouse gas emissions. But that does not mean that corporates or sectors should be going for net zero. Why? Because the use of offsets is simply a tool to allow additional fossil CO2 emissions to happen in general, right? They're not permanent. The scientific literature's in, to my taste. Recent reviews indicate 90% of offsets that have been reviewed are not additional, they're not real, they're not even verifiable. The other 10%, who knows? The delivery of benefits to, particularly for forest-based sequestration, has not emerged in practice. The proceeds have gone somewhere else. I would say the problem with offsets is terminally unfixable. That's my view of it now. And I go back to the findings of the high-level expert group on net zero from which this process came, where we said very clearly you should not be using offsets to align your sector or your company with 1.5 degrees. And that's a very central problem. If you want a really, really good real-time example of why this doesn't work, just go and look at Australia's sectoral targets and its safeguard mechanism, and there you will see that oil and gas companies are buying more and more offsets and expanding more and more their gas and oil development. That is what will really happen. That is what is actually happening in the world. We just can't afford that. We can't afford to trade off carbon sequestration in forests and ecosystems with fossil fuel emissions. If we ever could, that is a long past now. And that's what offsets do. They say, well, we can sequester carbon and we can count that and then we can give a gas company or a manufacturing company that. Now, there is actually a really interesting example going on in Australia of a company that is going to real zero, right? It's the fourth biggest iron ore miner on the planet. And they look like getting to real zero in their Scope 1 emissions, their production to the point of export, within the next 5 years. Now, that's an economic issue. Here's the next rub. Spending money on offsets is a diversion of scarce economic resources away from investing in the transition. Companies that do it, that invest in offsets rather than transformation, are going to lose the technology dividend. They're going to lose the economic dividend, and they'll ultimately lose the comparative advantage they would have got by getting to real zero.
Just to comfort you, Bill, make it very, very clear that the report and how the task force states when it comes to offsets is that offsets cannot be used for interim targets. They need to be disclosed separately. They need to, be actually follow what the ESRS at the very beginning said. So not only be disclosed separately, but what type of offsets, what type of certification, where is the integrity, and that emissions reduction should always be, the goal. It can be an additional contribution, but never been used for inside the value chain. So I assure you about that one. With that, I think unless we have any more comments, anything else you would like to add, I think we are concluding this event. Thank you so much for being with us for 1.5 hours. You are stars, Thank you so much. Please read the report. It's available on the PRI website and on LinkedIn. Thank you.